I will start with an opening prayer and then turn it to Dave. I'll turn it over to Dave Walter and let him introduce Phil Duffy. Dear Lord, please help the people in India. COVID is going wild there. I've been to India and they don't have the best hygiene situation, and they also aren't very good sometimes at taking care of themselves. So I expect it to be worse before it gets better. Let's hope that God intervenes and helps them get through. For them, it's really a plague. More formally, the Lord reminds us that we will pasture his sheep. He will give them rest when they need it. And what I say to you in the darkness, speak in the light, says the Lord. What you whispered, proclaim on the housetops. Hallelujah. Amen.
Amen.
Hey, Dave.
Okay, our speaker today is Phil Duffy. He's previously spoken to our group. He's a regular contributor to WFLY's The Constitution Matters program. He's author of the online course, Our Nation's Founding, A Singular Moment in History. He's an instructor with the Lifelong Learning Institutes at Immaculata and Widener. He's one of those increasingly rare birds. He's a self-described classical liberal. And his talk today is The Declaration of Independence, a Contrarian View. It focuses on the structure of the Declaration and the history of the thoughts that entered into it. It's contrarian because it challenges some widely held ideas about what the Declaration really means. So without further ado, Phil.
Okay, I guess it's good to be with you all. Let's see if I can get myself set up here. I think what I do is hit share screen. Is that right?
Share screen, Phil. Yep.
Okay.
And highlight
Okay.
presentation and then share.
All right.
Perfect.
There we are. Okay, contrarian view. Now, it's not going to be that contrarian, but basically, I promise to identify some areas where there are differences of opinion that can be expressed. As we get into this, first of all, let's see if we can advance it. There we go. Napoleon came up with a great idea, I think, which is, what is history but a fable agreed upon? Now, I don't think we need to go that far today, but basically the idea, I think, in exploring all history is that it's a very good idea to look at it critically, ask the questions. And when we get deeper into history, we find there are nuances that are terribly important. And that's basically the idea, this contrarian view, if you will, just to be a little bit nuanced. So this is a warm up. Who wrote the first draft of the Declaration of Independence? Any answers there, or shall I do this rhetorically? Okay.
I think rhetorically would be good, Phil.
Okay. Of course, it's the Declaration of Independence that was drafted by Thomas Jefferson. Okay, who formally initiated the Declaration of Independence? A little less known, Richard Henry Lee. And notice that the resolution in the Second Continental Congress was on June 7th in 1776, resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Now, there are actually 3 points to his statement here which flow through the Declaration of Independence. And one is that the independent states are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. That's the first idea. The second is that it is expedient forthwith to take the most effective measures for forming foreign alliances. And of course, the alliance with France in particular was very important in the War of the Independence from Great Britain. And then there's the third idea, that a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation. Now, that actually didn't occur immediately. Another year and several months actually elapsed before that happened. So what was the next step in the independence process? A committee of 5 was created to draft the declaration. Who proposed? Thomas Jefferson to prepare the first draft, and why? John Adams, although Jefferson disputed his account, John Adams later recalled that he had persuaded Jefferson to write the draft because Jefferson had the fewest enemies in Congress. So those days were like our days. Actually, Jefferson had some excellent preparation. He had written a summary view of the rights of British America, which was a tract written by him in 1774 before the US Declaration of Independence. And he laid out for the delegates of the First Continental Congress a set of grievances against King George III. And that's interesting because up to that point, the whole focus was against Parliament. It wasn't against King George. He was considered to be kind of uninformed, and he was allowing all those bad things to happen. But Jefferson saw it differently. The Declaration of Independence was written on behalf of how many states? Now, it's a shame that this one's rhetorical because this is a trick question. Most would say 13. The answer is 12. And here's why. Declaration of Independence is the statement adopted by the Second Continental Congress meeting in Pennsylvania State House, of course. And it was announced that the 12 American colonies and the state of Delaware, then at war with the Kingdom of Great Britain, regarded themselves as 13 newly independent sovereign states and no longer under British rule. Instead, they form a new nation, the United States of America. So there's something called Delaware Separation Day on June 15th. And basically the residents representing the 3 counties that were then the assembly of the lower counties of Pennsylvania, Newcastle, Kent, and Sussex upon Delaware, gathered in Newcastle and became the state's first capital. And what is known as Newcastle Courthouse Museum, part of the first state national historical park, they voted unanimously to reject not only the rule of England and King George III, but also the authority of the family of William Penn. So what was the first nation to declare its independence? In terms of contiguous sovereignty, at least nominally, that honor falls, as far as I can tell, to the Republic of San Marino, which gained its independence from the Roman Empire on 3 September 301 AD, meaning that it's been contiguously sovereign for 1700 plus years as of April 2020. And there are other, other arguments about the Vatican and so forth, but basically, probably San Marino is the major example. And this is what it looks like. It's a small republic, totally enclosed in Italy. And this is the fortress of Guaito on Mount Titano. So, okay, now that we're through the background here, let's talk a little bit about the structure of the Declaration of Independence. And basically, we'll talk today about the structure first, and then we'll go back to the history of liberty itself. And then really coming through both of those perspectives, if you will, we'll be getting into the source of ideas about liberty. And I think that's terribly important for us to know where these ideas really came from. The Declaration's components in this structure: preamble, grievances against King George III, and a statement of independence. And the preamble has 2 parts to it: why a statement was necessary and a statement of human rights. And we're familiar with the preamble. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. That's a very, very important part of this. And then a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So we have this basic idea of responsibility to mankind, which is a part of this Declaration of Independence, and particularly the preamble. Now, what about these rights? This is one of the most confusing things, and we're really dealing with the issue of who has what rights today. You can go all the way back and you can perceive where the idea of rights came from, but basically fairly early in the game, Cicero had identified the idea of human rights as law in the proper sense is right reason in harmony with nature. This is a consistent idea that you'll see with other thinkers coming forward. There will not be one such law in Rome and another in Athens, one now and another in the future, but all peoples at all times will be embraced by a single and eternal, unchangeable law. That idea of eternal law comes up again, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. So we see that there are two things going on here: the responsibility to mankind and an entitlement to natural rights. Now, where does this idea of human rights come from? We're probably, we see in the Declaration of Independence the statement that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the triplet that we're so familiar with, but it did not originate from Jefferson. Actually, John Locke preceded him, as did Francisco de Vitoria. And Vitoria was, as we will see later, he was the originator of this, these triplets that come up in history. Okay, Montesquieu comes out on equality with a very, very interesting statement, because the big question here is, what does equality mean? As distant from heaven is from earth, so is the true spirit of equality from that of extreme equality. The former does not imply that all should command, or that no one should be commanded, but that we obey or command our equals. In the state of nature, indeed, and we'll be coming back to this idea of the state of nature, all men are born equal, but they cannot continue in this equality. Society makes them lose it, and they recover it only by the protection of the laws. So there's the picture, being expanded to the protection of the laws. Now, Ludwig von Mises was arguably one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest economist of the 20th century. And he had a view on equality, which is both a negative and a positive. In dealing with conditions of civilized people, it is impermissible to disregard the differences in the quality of labor. Work which various people are able to perform is different because men are born unequal, there's that negative part of it, and because the skill and experience they acquire in the course of their lives differentiate their capacities still more. But he goes on and he says, in effect, the division of labor intensifies the innate inequality of men. Exercise and practice of the specific tasks adjust individuals better to the requirements of their performance. Men develop some of their inborn faculties and stunt the development of others. Vocational types emerge, people become specialists. So that's the positive side, because the division of labor is a major contributor to the progress of civilization. Now, I'll be talking later about Jesus of Nazareth and the view that he communicated through the Christian faith on the idea of the respect for the individual. So, human rights, where are they first stated very explicitly? And the statement in the Declaration of Independence is that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And that idea of law having a moral basis and the idea of the consent of the governed is expressed by Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologia. And there's a section in there called the Treatise on Law, which is very interesting. Now, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. You know, this idea of rebellion, if you will, is stated first by Thomas Aquinas, but also the Spanish scholastics who followed him, Francisco Suarez and Juan de Mariana. And then, of course, we're more familiar with these ideas being expressed by John Locke. And here's this very interesting statement. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. Now, you'll see this idea expressed another way, much earlier by Juan de Mariana. We need not worry about the public order being greatly disrupted by too many people taking up the practice of tyrannicide. Yeah, there's a very negative idea that comes from a Christian. Now, notice the difference in the delivery, the flowing language of Jefferson versus, and you'll see this over and over again as we make these comparisons, Jefferson's major contribution is the way he expressed ideas, and that way was important. If these ideas in their original form were just lumped together, they wouldn't have had anywhere near the impact that they did. And here's another example. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right and it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. It's concise, very clear, but listen to John Locke. I mean, obviously Jefferson had taken the idea from Locke. But if a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices, all tending to the same way, make the design visible to the people, and they cannot but feel what they lie under and see whether they are going, it is not to be wondered that they should then rouse themselves and endeavor to put the rule into such hands which may secure to them the end for which government was at first erected. Okay, he gets the original thought, but how much better expressed by Thomas Jefferson. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. Now, we're bridging into the list of grievances, and we took just a number of weeks on WFYL to go over these in detail. We're not going to do that. We don't have enough time, but basically note the focus, the grievances against King George III, something that started with Jefferson's first ideas for the First Continental Congress, now taking very, very sharp focus against King George III. And if you look at the grievances section, you'll find that there's a description of the grievances themselves. Then there's a statement of due process saying, okay, we tried to bring these ideas to you. And then finally, the actual bridge to the declaration of war. So if you want to get into the grievances in detail and the views that we the people, the Constitution Matters, you could look these up. You could hear podcasts on WFYL. Just do a Google search on WFYL podcasts. Go to the bottom of the list. We the People is the show, and we are at the bottom of the list. The actual podcasts are in transition right now. but I believe that you should be able to find them if you're interested. And it looked at one point like this. That's what the We the People main page looked like. And you can see there's Declaration of Independence, and there's another series that we're doing right now called Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists essays. Okay, this idea of we have petition is stated by Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act of which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. And it continues. It's not, Jefferson goes beyond King George III and now enlarges the audience of tyrants, if you will, those who are the circle around the king. Nor have we been wanting in our attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by the legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity. Well, what was going on? They were partying. The people in the upper class were partying. They had other interests, and they viewed what was going on in North America as something between savages and lower class Englishmen. So that leads to the declaration of war, which we must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. And of course, the whole conflict began at the North Bridge in Concord after Lexington Square. So the Declaration's components: a preamble, grievances against King George III, and a statement of independence. And that statement is, we therefore, the representatives of the United, notice, not capitalized, United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connections between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. Notice the connection between the resolution by Richard Henry Lee and this statement. And the conclusion, and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And they did, many of them, they did indeed. Okay, but what form of government was to have been created? Remember, at this point, no government was identified. They focused on the war. That's all they needed to do. Okay, that was the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. You notice that these were done away with by the Constitution of the United States. So our original Constitution created a perpetual union, which wasn't perpetual. It only lasted about, I think that would be about 8 years. It was created November 15th, 1777, a year after the Declaration of Independence. It was ratified on the 1st of March, 1781, when Cornwallis was chasing Greene around the South. The Yorktown surrender came several months later in 1781, October 1781. And the first draft of the Articles of Confederation was created by John Dickinson, the founder of Dickinson College. So what had history taught about the nature of freedom? Now we're going back, if you will, all the way to the beginning. And this relates to that statement that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So this is all about freedom. And if we go all the way back in recorded history, what has been the relationship of government to the people? Well, the Epic of Gilgamesh is an epic poem from ancient Mesopotamia that is often regarded as the earliest surviving great work of literature. And the first half of the story discusses Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, and Enkidu, a wild man created by the gods to stop Gilgamesh from oppressing the people of Uruk. And this is a common theme throughout history. You can't deny it. You know, that government and freedom of the individual have always been at loggerheads. So here are these concurrent concepts of government and individual freedom. But individual freedom is not just license to do whatever we want. There is a very, very strong constraint around it called social responsibility. And the government is constrained likewise by something called the law. And we can look upon history. One of the best examples of a flight from slavery to freedom is in Exodus. So is ancient Athens a model for the United States? We hear this so often. Very early, we have the Republic of Plato, giving us ideas of the ancient Greeks' view of government and the individual's role within government. I like to say it's the unrepublic of Plato. Both Aristotle and Plato condone slavery, so there's something to consider. And you know, what's the difference? Well, the Greeks enslaved other Greeks, and in the United States or the colonies prior to that, the enslavement was racially based. Look at some of Plato's beliefs here, and we're going to end up with one in particular, but just take a look at some of the things that Plato believed in. Now, this is considered to be a classic of political thinking and philosophy in Plato's The Republic. And let's consider one of Plato's ideas. The state seems to me to be genuinely wise, for its judgment is good, isn't it? And Plato had a view of democracy, which is totally in conflict with the way many of us think about ancient Greece and democracy. Democracy is an agreeable anarchic form of society with plenty of variety, which treats all men as equal. Here's that equality issue again, whether they are equal or not. So how does Attica or Athens compare to the United States? Well, basically, in terms of population, something like Sacramento, California. But there's more to it than that. Look at what Athens really was at its peak. The yellow areas are all of the parts that are in a so-called alliance with this city-state here called Athens, which is really a little bit more than that. So how democratic could something like this be when you think in terms of democracy as participation by the people? These people out here certainly couldn't participate in government here. And there's a great example of what Athens' so-called democracy was really about. It's called Amelian Tragedy. here's Milos, an island in the Aegean Sea. And here's Athens over here, and the rest of really, it was an empire. So this tragedy is described first in the history of the Peloponnesian War, and it was translated by Thomas Hobbes. It was authored by Thucydides. And here's what the Melian dialogue comes down to. The Melians appeal to the Athenian sense of decency. It is right that we be free. There's that idea that is expressed in the Declaration of Independence. The Athenians offered the Melians an ultimatum: surrender and pay tribute to Athens or be destroyed. Basically, they were telling them, you are a colony, live with it. And the idea was the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And here are the consequences. The Melian men were massacred, the women were and children were enslaved, and their declaration of independence was unsuccessful. Athenians had the first master race mentality. And this is from Pericles' funeral oration. Athens alone of her contemporaries is found when tested to be greater than her reputation, and alone gives no occasion to her assailants to blush at the antagonist by whom they have been worsted, or to her subjects to question her title by merit to rule. So there's an idea that we saw expressed in the Nazi era. How long did Athenian democracy last? 47 years, not very long. How's that compare with other democracies and republics? What was their duration? We see that the Roman Republic was 482 years in length, and the Republic of Venice, 1100. And the Swiss cantons all the way back to 1291. So one wonders why there's so much focus on the Greek example. Now, here's what our founders thought of this. A firm union, and this is Alexander Hamilton, firm union will be of the utmost moment to the peace and liberty of the states as a barrier against domestic faction and insurrection. It is impossible to read the history of the petty republics of Greece and Italy without feeling sensations of horror and disgust at the distractions with which they were continually agitated and at the rapid succession of revolutions by which they were kept in a state of perpetual vibration between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy. He was joined in that view by James Madison, who expressed it also in the Federalist Essays. How were things really done in those days? What was the essence of governance? Well, we know this example. This is the Roman example, governance by shock and awe. And we heard that theme repeated in Iraq, of all places. You know, we saw that the Iraqis were going to be brought to their heels through a military program of shock and awe. 480 years before the fall of Rome, it is the state that gets all the respect, not the individual. It's how the individual behaves and performs within the state that really matters. And then someone shifted attention from the state to the individual, even the lowliest and the most marginalized, and that was Jesus of Nazareth. And we know about the parable of giving to Caesar that which is Caesar, and it's all about the Caesar's coin, about giving to Caesar that which is Caesar's and to God that which is God's. Now there's an irony in this, because in essence, everything belongs to God. So at the end, the Jews understood that. You know, it was quite a retort to the Pharisees, really put them back. But think of the way Jesus of Nazareth communicated a lesson to us. Suffer the little children to come unto me. These were in effect marginalized. They really didn't matter in adult society until Jesus comes along and says, hey, consider them too. And the curing of the 10 lepers, Jesus restoring the sight of the blind man, and finally, Jesus and the woman taken in adultery. These are all marginalized people in society, and what he was saying is treat them all equally, because they're all equal in the eyes of God. So what is the common thread in the Gospels? It's a new dimension to freedom and government. It's all based upon humility and love. Love one another, even as I have loved you. Jesus shifted attention from the state to the individual, even the lowliest, the most marginalized. Ancient Greece and Rome addressed individual action as it related to the state. Christianity is simultaneously about respect for the individual and communal action. Just pass by that. And the point I'm trying to make about this is that when we talk about the Declaration of Independence, or we could talk about the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and so forth, we tend to talk about two ideas: the law, and those documents are the foundation of law, and we talk about the free market. There was a reference to commerce before, and certainly these ideas are built in. But we are not constrained to those two realms of human action. This is an idea that was brought out by that Ludwig von Mises, who wrote a major work called Human Action. There are multiple realms of human action, to include things like civility, charity, and finally, reconciliation among each other. So the basic idea is you can't focus just on things like the Declaration of Independence and so forth. We live in a world in which we have to balance all these realms of human action. I'll briefly go into Thomas Aquinas, and this is, I think, around the 13th century. These are the scholastics, and he taught at the University of Paris, and they had a certain method of teaching. It's called scholasticism, and it was dominated by academics or scholastics of the medieval universities. And there were about 7 to 10 of these medieval universities. And this is where that idea of the divine law, which is revelation, and natural law come together as being subsidiary to the eternal law. Of course, nobody knows what the eternal law is because it's God's wisdom. But the important thing here is that there are two sources, both revelation and this idea of the natural law. We'll get into that a little bit greater level of detail. And then subsidiary to that is human, or what is called positive law. And the idea that was first put forward by Thomas Aquinas is that this hierarchy excludes illegitimate human law. Things like the Nuremberg laws of 1935 that marginalized the Jews. So examples of human positive law: Magna Carta, Constitution, Geneva Conventions, and Nuremberg Tribunal. So here's that idea that was expressed by Ludwig von Mises earlier, that the division of labor improves human welfare. And Jefferson had stated it that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Yes, they are created equals, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Yes, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That doesn't mean that all come out equal and live equal lives on earth. So what is the pursuit of happiness? This is an interesting thing. That clearly goes back to John Locke. Private property is an absolute essential for liberty, but the pursuit of happiness is also being free of an oppressive government and the aggressions of others in the private sector. So basically, Jefferson was not embarrassed by the idea of property, he just saw it as being a part of a bigger picture. Of course, Thomas Aquinas was a major spokesman for natural rights, for the idea of consent of the governed, for society and state being for the individual. Notice the contrast with the Grecian and Roman ideas that the individual was for society or for the state. And there's that idea of tyrannicide. You can see it in Thomas Aquinas, that, you know, if somebody is terribly evil, you could take him out. Now, there's another theme that comes up during the medieval period, during the Renaissance, actually. And this is expressed by Machiavelli in The Prince. Any man who tries to be good all the time is bound to come to ruin among the great number of who are not good. Hence, a prince who wants to keep his authority must learn how not to be good and use that knowledge or refrain from using it as necessary, as necessity requires. Notice the contrast in thinking between Thomas Aquinas and Machiavelli. There's a different kind of a view, and we always deal with the issue of patriotism. Where does that fit into the picture? Boswell, or Samuel Johnson, I should say, had stated patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. And we're told that it's by Boswell that that's not really what he was talking about. He assures us that Johnson was not indicting patriotism in general, but only false patriotism. These are issues that we have to deal with today. Following the original scholastics, there was an area, subsequent practitioners of the basic ideas expanded on Thomas Aquinas. They were called the Spanish scholastics, and their home base was the University of Salamanca, one of those medieval universities. And here's that link, the idea of the triplet. One of the people of the, representing the Spanish scholastics was Father Francisco de Vitoria. And you can see his dates, 1492, he was born when Columbus discovered the New World. And this is all related to the enslavement of the Indians, by the way. And what he said was that natural law is not limited to Christian faithful. And a peer of his had said, those who are in the grace of God are not one whit better off than the sinner or pagan in what concerns natural rights. And the Indians in the New World owned their lands by the same principles that the Spaniards owned and owned theirs. And the pagan princes ruled legitimately, and their lands were to be considered sovereign. Notice the similarity with Cicero, the idea of universal law. And here's the triplet. All men are equally free on the basis of natural liberty. They have the right to life, culture, and property. And so Vitoria actually, and Vitoria was considered to be the father of international law. He actually preceded John Locke by more than a century. Did the church ignore slavery? Not really. Pope Paul III issued a papal bull, Sublimis Dei, in 1537, that the Indians were human beings and they were not to be robbed of their freedom or possessions. And he also issued a papal bull, Pastorale Officium, in 1537, which declared automatic excommunication for anyone who failed to abide by the new ruling. So the basis, the religious basis, the basis of faith was there against slavery at that early time, and yet it took centuries more for it to be fully implemented, the idea fully implemented. Francisco Suarez, on the consent of the governed and tyrannicide, said if the people or community confer state power on a king or set of rulers, may they not then take it away? And these ideas flow into the Declaration in the argument for the right of rebellion. We could look at John Locke and his predecessor, Thomas Hobbes, and see a contrast in thinking. Hobbes felt that in state of nature, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Whereas John Locke said a pre-government state of nature in which all men are free and equal. Very different points of view. Thomas Hobbes, a sovereign power is absolute, and that's the divine right of kings. Whereas John Locke says government is limited to securing the natural rights of its citizens. Equality is only equality under the law. Individuals forego some of their freedoms when they consent to be governed. In contrast, relations between nations are governed by the state of nature. And the relationship of government to citizens is bound by a social compact. That's an idea that comes forth, and basically the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation were social compacts. But here's that idea of revolution again. Revolution is a natural right against rebellion by the tyrant. A tyrant is no longer a political agent. He is a private person, a pirate and a robber, and a murderous animal. How much more nicely that was stated by Jefferson. So if you compare Locke and Jefferson, you see this difference in the ability to express an idea more concisely and more beautifully. Man being born has been proved with a title to perfect freedom and an uncontrollable enjoyment of all the rights and privileges of the law of nature, equally with any other man or number of men in the world, hath by nature power not only to preserve his property, that is his life, liberty, and estate. But compare that with, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Much big improvement. You could compare these if you wished, these ideas by Vitoria, Locke, and Jefferson, and basically they're all very, very consistent. There was an Algernon Sidney who was a major part of the ideas that flowed through into the Declaration of Independence. And this was just prior to I believe it was just prior to the British Civil War. The right of revolution: to retain its liberty, a society must be composed of people who are willing to question the authority of superiors. He was a pioneer in natural rights theory. Liberty was consistent with equality before the law, and many of the founding fathers were influenced by him. So he was tried and executed for allegedly plotting against Charles II. So here you have these radicals, if you will, John Locke, Algernon Sidney, and Montesquieu, all contributing ideas into the Declaration of Independence. Then there's a slightly different view that comes up simultaneously, almost, I guess, subsequently, but not by far. Rousseau's man is born free and is everywhere in chains, which is, it's a true idea, but basically it's a little expanded and hyperbole. Compare that with Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. This, I don't think, is the idea that really flows into the Declaration of Independence. It does have an effect, however, in the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror that occurred afterwards. So Rousseau felt there was no basis for human rights until the social order is established. That conflicts with Locke, who said free government state of nature in which all men are free and equal. He recognized that. Here's a questionable idea. The vote of the majority always binds all the rest, and a citizen must submit to the general will. If you look at this, there are thousands of people in Nazi Germany giving the Hitler salute, except Augie Landmesser. Can you imagine being in a situation like that? He was not submitting to the general will. What does it take for an individual to distinguish themselves from the rule of the mob? Okay, here's some thoughts on the social contract. Justice and morality don't exist in a state of nature. That's very similar to Machiavelli's ideas. Machiavelli's patriotism is whereas an absolute question of the welfare of our country, we must admit of no considerations of justice or injustice, of mercy or cruelty, of praise or ignominy. But putting all else aside, we must adopt whatever course will save the nation's existence and liberty. We hear variations of that theme in politics today. The community may seize individual property. The Constitution went against that by saying in Amendment 5, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And here's the one that I think really, really we should ponder. The state is a moral person and may use force against the individual citizen. Was this state a moral person? And according to Rousseau, the only voluntary decision is to join or not join the social compact. And based upon that, we exported Red Emma Goldman during the Red Scare. I believe that was in 1919 after World War I, and a number of other radicals. Liberty can't exist without equality. Yes, equality properly defined. But we have equality in Venezuela, and all are really oppressed and some are starving. Democracies are unstable. Yes, I think he got that right. Every law must be ratified by the people personally. Can you imagine every law being ratified in ancient Greece? No, totally wrong. Private interest masquerades as the general will. Yeah, how often do we see special interests in Washington? And the bills that come out state how great these ideas are for everybody, when in fact, they benefit the special interest. And he thought Christian servitude and dependence unsuited to a republic. Now, I would submit that Rousseau's ideas were really not a part of the Declaration of Independence. They're a mixture of sound and unsound thinking. There are inconsistencies and contradictions, and he gets lost in abstractions. He doesn't deal with application in government. And as we bring all of these ideas together, we should ponder the thought that the debate over freedom, rights, and law really continues today in our streets. Thank you. Any questions?
If you have a question for Phil, you may need to unmute yourself.
Should I stop the share here? And
Bob,
Yes, you can stop the share.
okay.
I might just a comment. I was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania back in the 1940s, I guess. And there was a professor on history of civilization named Paul Schrecker. He was a Jew. He had barely escaped Hitler's Germany. He had a comment about the four freedoms, where he said, I wish that Roosevelt had added another freedom, and that was the freedom to sleep. Well, that's just by the by. But I remember, I don't know now the context, but there's one quote that I remember, and you have given an awful lot of context. He said, you know, in the Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that originally that was life, liberty, and the pursuit of private property. And I suspect that all your discussion about Locke and, well, back and forth is a rather complex background for that statement that Dr. Schrecker made. I wouldn't know how to ask a specific question. It's just your lecture brought back a memory. That's all.
Well, thank you. Yes, if you look at the statement by Locke, and it is available, it can be found very easily on the internet. It's part of his second treatise of government. But if you look at that, he does talk about estate, and estate was a synonym for property, if you will. Now, he also indicated that we have a property in ourselves, so that very, very definitely there was, Locke originally stated it as property. There was nothing about the pursuit of happiness. And I kind of wrestled with this idea for a number of years. And my original thinking was there was an embarrassment over the idea of property, and that's why Jefferson substituted the pursuit of happiness. But as I got into this more deeply, I felt that Jefferson saw something beyond property when he was talking about the idea of the pursuit of happiness.
Well, to follow up on Bob Young's point and the conversation at the moment, there's a terrific book written by Hannah Arendt on revolution. In that book, she talks about the fact that life and liberty are pretty self-evident. Pursuit of happiness becomes very personal. What makes you happy may not be what makes somebody else happy. And the pursuit of happiness both creates conflict, but also helps us to realize our own self-potential. And it again is something that Jesus taught, that we have a right to find those things that make us happy, whether it's family, children, property, whatever it may be. That pursuit of happiness makes it a very individual thing. It's very different than life or liberty. And I think she's right. I think that pursuit of happiness really opens the door to a lot of individualism and a lot of things that go beyond what's of this world.
Yeah, I would agree with that very strongly. You may have remembered a slide that I put up about the different realms of human action. You know, we have a tendency to focus in those two areas: the market idea and the law. And my sense for that is that that's only a part of the total picture. If you don't get the rest of it, you know, then the pursuit of happiness becomes individualism and ignorance of the needs of others. So I would agree with Hannah Arendt on that very, 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 very much.
And also, Phil, I'd like to compliment you about something. I went to Williams College, small liberal arts college in Massachusetts. And when I was there, all the professors were Marxists. So when they talked about, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and all those things, God, Jesus, Christianity was never brought into the topic. You wove into your talk very, I think, impactfully and effectively, where a lot of the teachings of Jesus and Christianity have woven their way into our founding papers, and the great role it played, but also the force it gave to the words of Jefferson and others. And if you look closely, as you said, there's different phrases that he uses: supreme judge of the world, endowed by the creator, divine providence. And this is something that made the US Declaration of Independence and Constitution very different, is that we founded it on Christian values, what we thought were the highest ways of thinking and treating other people. And so I compliment you, because I don't think you can fully understand our founding documents unless you do weave Christianity into it and the teachings of Jesus. So I greatly appreciated that. You and I would have had a great time debating my professors the role Christianity played in these documents.
Thank you very much.
My question is, what evidence is there that that Jefferson and Hamilton and Madison and those people were familiar with all these previous works, especially Locke and Machiavelli and even the Bible? I presume that a lot of this stuff was written in books, and do we have evidence that they actually read and understood and use that background information, or how did they get it? Where did they? I mean, today we have great ability to get a hold of these things, but I just wonder, how the heck did they do it?
Well, in answer to your question about what access they had, theirs was a classic education. And so they spent a great deal less time in areas that consume our youth in particular, but also people of our generation. They were very, very aware of the classics. As I've gone through this course and this idea of the Declaration of Independence and other areas, what I have found are specific references to their knowledge of those who preceded them. It's amazing how you could go book by book, let us say, of these classics, and they're referenced by these individuals. So absolutely, I mean, it's amazing how strong their exposure to classics was.
Phil, there's probably 50 different lectures you could do based on what we saw. My comment is how the Declaration is such a foundational document in American history that it's been misappropriated many times by people who do not believe in the words that they're spouting. And the biggest example, I guess, is in the Second American War of Independence, or the Civil War as we call it, where the South relied on the preamble of the Declaration to justify separation from the northern states, and they were doing it to advance the idea of slavery.
Okay, that's a very interesting question, because as I look at the Declaration of Independence, one of the things that really hit me hard was the statement that all men are created equal. Now, of course, we could say today all persons are created equal. I think that would be a slight improvement. But clearly, one of the limitations that we have is that the Declaration of Independence is not specifically linked into our Constitution. And I think that if it had been, that I guess it was the Dred Scott case that went for the slaveholders. I think the Supreme Court would have had a very difficult time in justifying that decision, because you can't get around the idea that Jefferson said, and the Declaration states, all men are created equal. Hello. If you look very closely at the Constitution, what you find is that these Black slaves were identified as persons. That's really interesting. So yes, you could justify separation, secession, I think, based upon the Declaration of Independence, but you can't justify slavery.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, in that, when they were writing this, unfortunately, they didn't consider Blacks to be humans. And they thought of them more as property and chattel.
Mm-hmm.
And so those original cases before the Supreme Court kind of went the wrong way.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until we really said, you know what, equal means equal, black, white, yellow, whatever you are. And we also said that education had to be equal. When we got to Brown versus the Board of Education in Kansas, it was decided in that case that it wasn't okay that you both could go to school. It was that the educations had to be equal to each other.
Yeah.
So, these things evolved as time went by, but, I agree. Had it been spelled out clearly in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, would have had a lot less problems as we move forward.
Well, didn't Jefferson's first draft include a anti-slavery clause that they had to take out because it was politically expedient to do so? You wouldn't have gotten the southern states to agree in the first place if it had been in there.
Yeah, you're right, David.
I know that Jefferson's initial inclination and efforts were against slavery. And when you think of the remainder of his life, that's an immense contradiction. And if you think of that thought, that is the problem, I think, in looking at history. If we attempt to look at it in a binary way, that there are good guys and bad guys. I mean, all of us have feet of clay. So you get a much richer view of history, I believe, if you recognize that fact that we have these good inclinations and actions, and we have also on the downside the bad.
Phil, you said that government and individual freedom have always been at loggerheads. Did many of the signers wrestle with this debate in their own minds?
I'm sure they did, and we can't really see it so much there as we can in the Constitution. At WFYL, we're doing a series right now on the Federalist essays versus the anti-Federalist essays, and it really is very clear there. Yeah, they were concerned.
Any other comments, questions for Phil?
I'll just throw out a dilemma for all of us to think about, which is, when the devil confronted God, he basically said, I'm rebelling against you because you're a tyrant. So we have to remember that there are balances on both sides. And I kind of understand where the South was coming from, in the sense that their whole economic system was based on slavery. The only way they can make money and import and export cotton and all those things was because they had a cheap form of labor. And basically, when we said things had to change, they saw it as our taking away their livelihood. And they also took it as tyranny of the industrial states, coming industrialism, to change the economic system in this country. And so they fought heartily against it. But I always think you have to look on both sides. You have to understand where both sides are coming from if you're going to come to a true judgment as to what's right and what's wrong. And I have great sympathy for the South, although I totally disagree with them. But at that time, property and money was everything. And they saw their whole way of living was going down the drain.
Could I be allowed a commercial break here?
Yeah, Phil, tell us what you're up to these days.
Okay, I have to go through this process now. So let's see, I share screen.
Yeah,
I do this.
highlight the one you want to share.
Okay,
No.
here we go. I'm in the process of writing a book, which hopefully I'll be able to finish by the end of the summer. It's called A Tale of Four Cities. It has a subtitle, which is just a little bit misleading. It's discovering the Marxist collectivist roots. And it's called A Tale of Four Cities because it begins in Paris and London with the great bubbles, the Mississippi bubble and the South Sea bubble, Mississippi bubble in Paris, South Sea bubble, and that goes back to 1720. And ultimately it has implications for the rise of Benito Mussolini in Rome and Adolf Hitler in Munich. But in connection with this, the part up here really brings out the stories of an economist who preceded Adam Smith by the name of Richard Cantillon. And he actually worked in Paris. He was an Irishman, believe it or not, who was a banker in Paris, and he did just an incredible job. He shorted, in effect, these bubbles and became very, very wealthy. He was probably one of the 10 wealthiest bankers of that time. But it's an interesting story because what it points out is that Adam Smith could never be considered the father of modern capitalism, that he's gotten these ideas from other thinkers. But in addition to that, he distorted some of the ideas of Cantillon and set up the idea of class warfare, which was brought to its logical conclusion by Karl Marx. So it's a very, very networked kind of story, which I hope I'll be able to bring out. If anybody is interested in a pre-published version of the story, I'll be glad to send a copy to them. And I don't know how we would arrange that. I know you've got my email. So, if anybody is interested in seeing a copy of that, I'll be glad to get them a copy.
Bill, it sounds like you just filled one of the speaking slots for the fall for us. You can
It's a deal.
hopefully we'll be meeting in person and you can sell and autograph your book.
Well, it'll be an ebook, so I don't know how we do that, but yeah. But thank you very much. I would very much like to do that, and I enjoyed very much being with all of you today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Excellent.
Okay, signing off.
Okay, thanks, Phil.
Let's see how we do that now.
You can just, down in the lower right, you can click end.
Leave.
Let me see if I can stop sharing
Oh, first stop here.
and then leave, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Bye.
Have a good week.
you too.
See you in the fall.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye.
Next week, we're up with Ted and Rick on genealogy.
Mhm.
We hope so.
Okay.
All right.
Well, we all find we're descended from Charlemagne.
We don't go quite back that far, but we go back a ways. All right. See you all next week.
Is Phil Duffy a member of our church?
No, he's
No.
he's a Catholic.
Oh, okay.